Good morning, brothers and sisters. Donald Philip Veach from Jacksonville, North Carolina. Let us open in prayer. Almighty and everlasting God, who's given unto us thy servants grace, by the confession of a true faith, to acknowledge the glory of the eternal Trinity, in the power of the divine majesty to worship unity. We beseech thee that thou wouldst keep us in this faith, and evermore defend us from all adversities, who livest and reignest one God, world without end. Amen. Well, we continue our studies with Professor Jasper Ridley on Thomas Cranmer. We should bring this chapter to a close today. We've been learning as we go here, watching Cranmer closely. In another series that we're studying with Prof. Thomas and the 39 articles, we sort of jumped out ahead of where we're at now. And we were looking yesterday at 1536, the 10 articles, 1539, the 6 articles with intervening, never had any royal sanction, but was found in Cranmer's papers, 13 articles that had the 17 articles as its provenance as a result of German-English collaborations. Prof. Thomas didn't treat that in any fuller way, just he dealt with the 10 and the 6. But that's out into the 1530s, and we're still back here with Professor Jasper Ridley. And Cranmer has returned to England in 1531 after his almost 1 year ambassadorial tour to the continent, to Italy. So let's pick up where we were. In a letter to Wiltshire, which was written from Hampton Court, Cranmer mentioned that the king and Anne had ridden to Windsor together and then returned to Hampton Court. Jasper says Henry was now cohabiting with Anne. We're not sure, but that's what he says. Cranmer probably resumed residence at Durham House. That was the Boleyn family residence, Earl of Wiltshire, with the Boleyns when he returned from Italy in October 1530. So this period, we have more questions about what is Tom reading. We're particularly interested in his doctrinal development as pertains to the English Reformation. What books was Cranmer engaging with? I don't think we're going to get a lot of that here, but Cranmer was a man of the books, and we're people of the books. We want to know what he's reading, what he's thinking. Oh, he'll be a dinner companion, table companion with Tom Cranmer, talk theology. That, I think, was more of it, would have been to his liking. And then in October 1530, Cranmer moved to the court as Anne's chaplain, for he already held this post by January 1532. This means for at least 6 months, Cranmer saw Henry and Anne day after day while they were cohabiting as man and wife. By this time, Cranmer had thoroughly convinced himself that Henry's marriage to Catherine was unlawful, that Henry was acting virtuously in putting away his brother's relict and sending her to live at the Palace of Moor in Hertfordshire. We've raised this: how genuine was Cranmer about this nullification? By all outward appearances, he favored it, and he favored it early. We got a footnote here. Cranmer must have been a royal chaplain before he left for Ratisbon in January 1532, for he's referred to as the king's chaplain in a document drafted by Cranmer himself before his return to England. That's next year, 1532. Let's get through 1531 here. But this did not make it permissible for Henry to commit fornication with Anne. And Cranmer must have known that they were doing this. He's not the Archbishop now. What's Tom's duties to the king in this respect? Silence. Maybe there's an element to the timidity, but naivete, no. We do not know whether he pretended not to notice or not, or whether he addressed some words of reprimand to the king and the lady. We wonder the same thing. But he can hardly escape the charge of having connived at this sin. He was not only a Catholic priest who was tolerantly overlooking the immorality of his patrons in 1531. We talked about the money exchanging hands from the English delegates to the papal delegates, to the canonists and the lawyers in the universities for opinion favorable to Henry. Just how honest is Cranmer here? And let's think as Calvinists, bringing our Old and New Testament and systematic studies to bear, and our larger church history studies and practical theology. And we're going to have to draw a blank here, because we've got a period of silence, and that's fact. Over here is where we do the opinion and inferential work, and it's just hard to say what were Tom's thoughts in this period. He didn't pen anything to my knowledge, but he saw things. He was clearly not a naive man. He knew man is a sinner. Again, he's an ordained doctor, ordained priest. He continued to be a busy propagandist for the king's divorce. It was during this period that Cranmer was employed in an attempt to convince Sir Thomas More, good luck with that Henry's marriage to Catherine was unlawful. More was still Lord Chancellor and was dutifully serving the king in public, but he had not hesitated to tell him in private of his opposition to the divorce. Cranmer, Edward Lee Fox, that's Edward Fox, not John, and Nicholas de Burgo engaged in many arguments with More, but they did not succeed in convincing him that Henry's case was right. Cranmer was also engaged in translating into English a Latin treatise by Stokesley, Fox, and de Burgo, in which the judgment of all the universities which had held for Henry were examined and extolled. So Cranmer's doing some academic work, working in the Latin, as we'd expect with a scholar. Cranmer made a number of alterations and additions to the text in translation. It seems to me I heard something about that volume in one of the English libraries, and I'm drawing a blank here. Let's carry on. It was probably about this time that he was appointed Archdeacon of Taunton. It's difficult to discover the date at which he obtained this preferment. One authority has stated that it was as early as 1525, but it's more likely to have been 1531. Yeah, we would agree that would be a little bit of a too early date, 1525, that'd be our guess. 1531 is more reasonable. He's already been serving the Henry. He was Archdeacon of Taunton by January 1532 when he left it on his second foreign mission. He was also granted some other benefits which cannot be denied. Now, a little bit here, some footnotes on the Sir Thomas More discussions with Cranmer and Lee and others. More to Cromwell. The book which Cranmer translated was published in London in 1531 under the title The Determination of the Most Excellent Universities. That's the book I want to get my hands on. Really see what the arguments are on the two Levitical texts and the Levirate law text of Deuteronomy 25. See Stokesley to Cromwell. The original record of Cranmer's appointment as Archdeacon of Taunton has been lost. Pollard, in his book, Thomas Cranmer, tremendous book. That would be worth reading after this. Cranmer is referred to as Archdeacon of Taunton in all documents while he was the ambassador at Ratisbon during 1532. We're getting ahead of ourselves here. 1532 is coming. He's going to make a second ambassadorial tour to Europe. But during that period is what Pollard is saying. He had an archdeaconry. He probably was made archdeacon before the second foreign mission and not, as Maurice, Cranmer's secretary, says, before his first. For Maurice did not realize that Cranmer returned to England between his missions to Italy and Germany. Cranmer refers to my benefice in his letter to Wiltshire, 13 June 1531. We have one glimpse of Cranmer between his visits to Italy, 1530, and his trip to Germany, 1532. He was present at the reconciliation between Gardiner and Barnes. Ooh, this is delicious. At Hampton Court, which must have taken place at the beginning of December 1531. Barnes, who had been the prior of the Austin Friars at Cambridge, had been brought before Wolsey on a charge of heresy, 1526. But Gardiner had induced him to recant. This had saved Barnes' life. He was merely incarcerated in a monastery, but after he escaped to the Lutherans in Germany, he denounced Gardiner for having persuaded him to renounce the truth. So we got some bad blood here. By 1531, Henry was interested in making contact with the Lutherans, and he gave Barnes a safe conduct to come to England and invited him to court. Soon after Barnes arrived, he had a talk with Gardiner at Hampton Court, at which Cranmer was present. Now, this is the Robert Barnes who created quite a firestorm with a Christmas Eve sermon, 1525, in Cambridge. And Barnes, the extrovert, former prior of the Augustinian monastery at Cambridge, will be the proto-Lutheran in Cambridge. Extrovert, he goes to Wittenberg, gets a doctorate there, studies, meets Luther, Melanchthon. And he will ultimately die in 1540, but we get ahead of ourselves here. Anyways, Cranmer's present for this Barnes-Gardiner discussion at Hampton Palace. And according to Gardiner, Barnes asked his forgiveness for having criticized him. This was some months before Cranmer came into contact with Osiander and the Lutherans of Nuremberg. Let's just stop for a minute. So Barnes is in the Lutheran camp, and Cranmer's there listening to these two guys. We raised the question again and again and again. We did in the 1520s. We do again here. What does Cranmer know at this point in 1531? When does he know it? What is he reading? What does he believe by this point? I personally think he was a high scripture man by this point. That will fully emerge later, but it takes him a while. He's living under a tutor arrangement. We know he's acquainted with Lutheran literature, compliments of Bishop John Fisher by 1528. We know by 1521 he's aware of the German problem, and he's set himself to the task of studying the Bible because he realizes these issues go to the heart of the faith, not the tertiary things, tangential things, but fundamental things, if we can use that term, that troubled term in our times, fundamentals of the faith. So Cranmer, 1531, here with this meeting, he's listening to Gardner, he's listening to Barnes, he's reading, marking, learning, and inwardly digesting. And I think this is a very important observation by Prof. Ridley. This point here, this meeting, we have a fact, a data point. A data point. Now, we'll establish the facts as we can and are able, and then we can come over here and do our opinings and our inferential work, keeping them separate. Facts and then interpretation of the facts. And to get the facts, we have to get back in the period, see what happened, and think their thoughts after them. Kind of a grammatical, historical approach. This was some months, okay, we already mentioned that. It would be interesting to know the attitude which he adopted at this meeting between the pardoned heretic and the new Bishop of Winchester. 1531 now. And in fact, Ridley's wondering the same thing I've just talked about. By the way, Winchester's 60, 70 miles or so, 50 miles southwest of London, about 7 to 8 o'clock. As the crow would fly, if due north is 12 o'clock. And he will be buried in Winchester. A wealthy city, and I think it's also the city where King Alfred the Great kept his capital. We soldier on. But Gardner did not give any indication of Cranmer's reaction when he revealed the incident to the world in his book Against George Joy in 1541. This book, Declaration of Such True Articles as George Joy hath gone about to confute his faults, in the letters of Stephen Gardner. That's 1545. George Joy is a Lutheran, I think, if memory serves, was connected with Tyndale and Coverdale. He's on the continent. He's Lutheran. Might be called an advanced Lutheran. It's interesting that the fact is that Gardner never mentioned Cranmer's involvement in that discussion with Barnes. Again, fact, an argument from silence. So we've got to be careful over here what we might infer. By that time, 1545, Barnes had been burned as a heretic, while Cranmer was still, to all appearances, Gardner's fellow counselor and brother bishop, though Gardner had been secretly plotting to denounce him as a heretic. Gardner had been involved in the prebendaries plot and knew of it and about it, thought little of Cranmer. So Gardner's statement therefore tells us nothing beyond providing additional proof that Cranmer spent much time at court. I think that's a very prudent approach and careful approach by Prof. Ridley. It's interesting. He doesn't go too far. He points out some facts, and then he inserts his opinions. And we like the way he's doing his work here. So we finish this chapter 2 on Cranmer's introduction to Henry VIII at sometime in late 1529, starting with the famous Waltham Abbey with Fox and Gardner. And by October 1529, he's come to Henry's attention. And by January 1530, he's off to the continent of Italy and the continent, securing opinions in favor of Henry's nullification. I don't call it divorce, because he was married, but nullification. And then toward the end of this period, 1531, and starting into 1532, he's spending a lot of time at court. He's aware of Henry and Anne's possible cohabitation, and he's aware of the Lutheran problem between Barnes and Gardner. So now let's press on, starting in January 1532, on Cranmer's ambassadorial duty. And I'll insert, I've long thought that this is certainly a major turning point for Cranmer. This service to Henry, it marks a change in his lifestyle from academic Cambridge don to ambassadorial servant to Henry in the court. Promotion, perhaps, you want to infer that. Preferment, I would think that would be acceptable. From my standpoint, this is an opinion, I think it was a demotion. He's got to go run around the continent for Henry. Now, if you like traveling, maybe that's okay. But you got to represent the king and his viewpoints. You're on his dime and dole. You want to step down to do that rather than being at Cambridge, involved in quiet research and reading, and praying, and working with young students. I guess it depends on your perspective. For me, my perspective, I'd rather be in my library reading than serving President Donald J. Trump, or serving on the staff of the House and Senate representatives. Let's pick up now. Chapter 3, it's entitled Ambassador at Ratisbon. It's a city in the continent, and it's where Charles V, the emperor, was at. January 1532, Cranmer was appointed as resident ambassador at the emperor's court. That's a full authorization by Henry. Charles V resided in turn in different parts of his empire, and now was traveling from Brussels to Ratisbon. Cranmer followed the emperor and had reached Ratisbon by 14 March. Pause here again. We continue to what books? Did he take any books with him? It's kind of hard to conceive of. We're very interested in Cranmer's bibliographic involvements and engagements and ponderings. On his way, he passed through Nuremberg and had his first experience of a town under Lutheran control. Just pause there. That's huge. You know that this academic is going to be interested in what's going on. You know, he knows the Lutheran stuff, some of it. From John Fisher, of all things. We know that for a fact from his marginal notes where he's comparing Luther and Fisher. So this academic, grave and serious man, he's called by one biographer, he noticed that they read a chapter of the New Testament in church every day. My goodness. So Cranmer's in the churches, or a church. Was it the Cathedral of Nuremberg? Ridley doesn't say. When he reached Ratisbon, he was able to compare impressions with Eliot, the retiring ambassador who passed through Nuremberg with Charles Court a short time before Cranmer. So, as you'd expect, people talk, right? Cranmer obviously is interacting and engaging. And let's see if he likes this one chapter of New Testament every day in a Lutheran church. Was it German? I think so. That's my theory. Ridley doesn't tell us. Eliot had been struck by the fact that they had eaten meat in Lent, though they had specifically provided him with fish. He particularly noted that the priests were married, that their wives were the most handsome women in Nuremberg. Eliot returned to England soon after Cranmer arrived, leaving his duties, his property, and his financial difficulties to his successor. Eliot had been allowed £1 a day for his expenses, and Cranmer probably received the same allowance. This might seem generous enough at a time when the average daily worker of an unskilled laborer in England was 4 pence, and the price of wheat was high at 8 shillings a quarter. But an ambassador abroad was obliged to incur considerable expenses in the way of traveling. Still does, doesn't it? Today we incur expenses when we travel. And sending messengers in post, which cost a great deal. And he was also expected to maintain a household and state suitable to his station and dignity of his king. Cranmer found considerable difficulty in doing this, and Hawkins, his successor as ambassador to the emperor, complained next year that like Cranmer, he was forced to eat off pewter dishes, all horrors, whereas all the other ambassadors at Charles' court had silver dishes at table. If Cranmer made similar complaints, the documents have not survived. So I think that's where we'll take a break and return here, God willing, tomorrow. We're on the continent again with Cranmer, and he's at Charles V's court examining Lutheranism. Back to our controlling questions. What does Cranmer know? In terms of the English Reformation, what does he know of Lutheranism, Zwingli, Colloquy of Marburg, Diet of Augsburg, 1530. When does he know it? How does he know it? What's he reading? Let's pause for prayer. May all of the praise, the honor, and glory be to you, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Until tomorrow, God willing, Godspeed.